Hi everybody, and welcome back to Rise Talks, the podcast where we discuss business aviation operations, how to make operations more efficient, how to make them more sustainable too. We have a very special guest today on Rise Talks, which is Kennedy Ricci. Thanks very much for being with us, Kennedy. You are the president of 4Air, and you have been leading the charge on sustainability for a few years now. So very excited to have this discussion with you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
If I start with just a very open-ended question, Kennedy. So how is 4Air doing, and can you remind me what 4Air's mission is?
So when we launched 6 years ago, I think the main push was looking at how do you make sustainability more accessible? There was all of these different pillars of sustainability. There was clearly not one solution for aviation. So getting involved in a meaningful way took a lot of effort, and we wanted to make it easier. We saw the push for the industry to need to be some more sustainable. We saw the desire from pilots and owners to be more sustainable, but actually doing it well and getting involved was difficult. On top of that, you had all this regulation coming out on the horizon and new policies that had just been enacted. So it was this combined effort of kind of regulatory compliance of doing what you had to do, but then also trying to layer on more ambition on top of it. So we built kind of four voluntary levels of sustainability aligned to those pillars, looking at what can we do today versus what are the solutions that you have out there tomorrow. And then how do we layer that onto regulatory compliance and reporting requirements, making it easier for you to be in compliance with CORSIA and other EU, emissions trading schemes. Same thing in the UK. We've seen a rise of those around the world, and those will often include domestic aviation emissions. CORSIA being what really is looked at for international emissions. So our main push has been to build these programs to make it very easy for people to both be in compliance and be involved in sustainability, and we've been really happy with our ability to work with a number of different operators across the group, across the industry. To date, we've offset or addressed the emissions from more than 2 million flight hours, and that's about a little more than 7 million metric tons of CO2. To give you some perspective, the entire industry is about 20 million metric tons per year. So we've done a significant chunk over the course of our 5 years, but we'd love to continue working to help the industry be carbon neutral in a given year.
Right. Yes, because the goal that everybody's aiming for
Correct.
is 2050, isn't it? Can you remind us what 2050 is about?
Exactly. How do we get to net zero by 2050? And I think for aviation, we've often said, we can do it today, but it's about looking at more in-sector solutions. It won't be just a simple one size fits all. We'll need fleet, efficiencies and operational efficiencies. We'll need airspace improvements. We'll need sustainable aviation fuels. We'll probably need some carbon removals or carbon offsets. We'll need to be more smarter about how we fly the aircraft for non-CO2 impacts. So it won't just be, there'll probably be some electric aviation, in parts of the industry as well, but it won't be any one of these being what fully gets us there.
I mean, this was the whole idea behind my invitation, right? Is at Rise we tackle the efficiency angle. So take the industry the way it is now and just make it more efficient. But to your point, that's just one slice of the chart, and then there is the rest. There's essentially reducing is one lever, and then what you can't reduce, then you offset. Is that the general logic?
Exactly. And there's will be kind of layers of where you start, right? Efficiencies are something we can implement today and are pretty much largely responsible for the progress we've had today. It's always the metrics can get confusing, but today we can move one person 1 kilometer basically 40% more efficiently than we could 40 years ago. And so the industry hasn't reduced itself 40%, but we've gotten 40% more efficient at moving people. Now the industry's grown, we're moving a lot more people, a lot more kilometers, but that efficiency is, if we didn't have that, our emissions would be much higher than they are today. So we've already achieved a really significant chunk of emission reductions compared to, we've been able to decouple the growth of the industry from the growth of our emissions pretty substantially. We have a long way to go, but efficiencies have been really largely responsible for the progress we've made today. And we'll keep being kind of that first layer of defense, of what we can do with our given technology and fuels. As you move beyond that, sustainable aviation fuels, actually replacing the fuels that we use today with more circular, carbon, recycled carbon, essentially. Rather than digging carbon up out of the ground, we're able to recycle carbon that was already in the biosphere, already in the atmosphere through used cooking oils or bio-based waste sources, and that reduces the amount of net new carbon we're adding to the atmosphere. So those solutions help a more in-sector solution to reduce aviation's kind of net additional emissions. We've done a lot of support around electric aviation and evaluating hydrogen aviation. And I think, hydrogen will be a challenge to see in the industry, but electric aviation, we have that, around today. They're very small aircraft, usually kind of in training formats, but the simplicity behind an electric aircraft is amazing. It's so much easier to operate, so much quieter, so much more cost effective. So as battery densities catch up, and we'll see even if they doubled kind of every 5 years, which is what we kind of see as the pace right now, you still need 30, 40 years to really get competitive with kind of the energy density that you see on kerosene. So I think they'll have an amazing impact in the general aviation market, especially as we don't really have a sustainable replacement for aviation gasoline. So on piston aircraft, most of them are not using Jet A or diesel. They're using an avgas, and we just don't really have a SAF equivalent for it. So I think you'll see electric aviation address that kind of piece of the market, but will be an amazing opportunity to make it more affordable to fly and more affordable to train and easier to get involved into aviation. And then you'll see things like you said, the residual emissions that we'll have to address through carbon offsets or carbon removals.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting how you're essentially saying, well, what's purely general aviation running on avgas has a path which is mostly electric, or that's where electric will has the most promising future. And then to your point, what's today, I guess, the bulk of business aviation, everything that has a jet engine on it, that's mostly sustainable fuel, isn't it? That's where the push needs to happen.
We actually did a study. So we have something we call our Aviation Climate Fund, and it's basically the people who are level 4 kind of in our rating system. We have support go towards researching these future solutions. So things like contrail avoidance, hydrogen, electric aviation. We have some grants around that. But one of the research pushes we did was looking at it was in partnership with the U.S. university. If we didn't use kerosene, if we could use any chemical to be an energy storage for jet fuel, for jets, for aviation, we need something that's liquid at room temperature. We don't want to get any, crazy cryogenic storage or pressurization storage. We need to be liquid. We want it to fit in normal airplanes, and we need something that's very energy dense. And they looked at, ethylene, ethanol, all the other kind of different fuels we might think of, and kerosene was the most perfectly designed. I mean, that was kind of the optimal combination of the handling characteristics that we need, and then in a very energy dense liquid. So, okay, now the question becomes, how do we make kerosene better? Because it is the kind of ideal fuel for the airplanes that we have today. Now, if you redesigned aviation from ground zero and looked at, thinking about how do we rebuild an aircraft with a hydrogen storage solution, you would redesign what the aircraft looks like completely, and you redesign what airports look like completely, and you might have a more efficient kind of system overall. But to incorporate it, today to start up with hydrogen when we already have a kerosene kind of infrastructure makes it a really challenging solution.
Right. Yeah. No, understood. So it is certainly on for jet engines. It is the sustainable aviation fuel that's looking like it needs an acceleration. You guys at 4Air are able to organize SAF either directly, the uplift or the compensation, don't you?
We look at SAF in two ways. We've worked with FBOs around the world. There's about 120 some now that have physical SAF availability. So we verify what locations have SAF. There's a lot of announcements when we were starting out of people saying they had SAF, but if you called them, they might not know that they had SAF, or the wasn't physically available at that time. So we try to give some operators some verification and kind of pre-work to understand where that availability is. And it's been tremendous to see that expansion over the last few years. So it really started out, in the US, for example, in California and kind of the Southwest. Now we've seen it pretty much across the entire US as they've been able to incorporate it into existing infrastructure. So using existing pipelines And same thing within Europe, as you've had the refuel EU mandate spread out that supply requirement, you've seen a growing number of airports that have physical availability. But still, that's about 100 and some airports. Business aviation serves over 5,000. So getting staff available at all locations that we serve is just good, is another challenge that lies ahead of us. So using book and claim, where we have the fuel go to an airport, we remove the environmental attributes of it, we trace that through a registry, very similar to how we do for renewable electricity. You have two options if you're going to use renewable electricity. You could either hook up the wind farm to your house directly, so you know that all of those green electrons going to your house, or you could hook up a wind farm into the grid and know that there's a certain amount of green electrons going into the grid that are displacing fossil-based ones. And that's the way the book and claim works. We know that there's a certain amount of SAF going into the fuel system more broadly, and that's displacing fossil fuel elsewhere. So as long as we can record who owns those environmental attributes, just like you do with renewable energy credits, we can use book and claim as a more efficient solution to meet sustainability, to meet SAF demand for operators who are visiting places without the physical supply. And so now you're saving carbon of moving the fuel physically to these new locations, and you're reducing cost, obviously, to keep it there. So we can see, almost up to 50, 60% cost reduction by using book and claim versus uplifting physical SAF.
Yeah, that would be a huge advantage, right? You're right. It does rely, however, on the verification, and I guess this appears to be one of the big missions of 4Air. I mean, I've heard you talk about verification a lot. This seems to be it's that stamp that you bring to the SAF that's being used, right? And if it's not going in your wings, we're still guaranteeing that it has been produced from pre-existing CO2. Is that the idea?
Exactly. So one of the areas we looked at, we like to consider ourselves like in a niche of a niche, right? Because business aviation especially, is its own niche of aviation. Sustainability is its own niche. And so we're really sitting at the intersection of both of those. And what we saw was, for business aviation using SAF, we have some of these unique challenges. For example, the fact that we're servicing 10 times the number of airports as commercial aviation. As you saw SAF registries come to market to support book and claim, a lot of them were looking at this from the perspective of an airline buying a few million gallons or several million liters of SAF at one time. And that was about the size. When you make SAF, you have to blend it, and you often blend it in batches. So you'll have batches that are on the scale of millions of liters. And business aviation, obviously, we're not buying millions of liters at a time. We're buying 600, 1,000 liters, 2,000 liters. And so we had these almost micro transactions of SAF. We had to be able to break up these transactions and know that I bought, a few thousand gallons, you bought a few thousand liters, and that had to come out of the same accounting system to incorporate what units I wanted to see, what appropriate carbon tracking for both of us. And so we built a registry that was a little bit more geared towards business aviation, and especially on these microtransactions and the unit flexibility. We saw that the fuel suppliers would quote in one unit, so you might see cubic meters or tons of fuel. We're uplifting in another metric, and then ultimately we care about the amount of carbon that we reduced. So you had this whole units problem of just the supply chain. Not to mention, when we are tracking SAF, there's about 30 or 40 data points that you have to track before you can claim fuel for an emissions reduction credit. So where did the fuel come from? What was the blend? What was the carbon intensity? What was the energy content? Where did it come from in the world? And all of that affects its eligibility and how much carbon you can actually claim. And like we said, we need to know exactly how much of batch one did I get versus batch two did you get versus batch three. And so that's what we built this, we call it the Assure SAF registry, to help track that, especially for business aviation. So that verification, that traceability of knowing exactly where the SAF came from, where the fuel, what the emissions reductions from the fuel was, is critical, I think, to do this robustly, and it's something that we saw a unique need for business aviation in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you guys were really trailblazing this, and I can understand how before 4Air there was just no knowledge, no understanding of where to start. But I can imagine the traceability. I mean, of course, it's fundamental in mandatory schemes, but it's probably just as important in voluntary, right? If you have an owner or an operator or the end client on board the plane that wants to do something, which is do some SAF book and claim or compensate their CO2. I guess that it's probably just as important to be able to put them at ease with the fact that yes, it's in the background, it's happening. They're actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Absolutely, and I think important that they trust us that we're actually can defend the staff that we've sourced for them, either through book and claim or that we've helped them uplift physically. That we can show them all of the documentation behind it. Pretty much everything we do ends up going through audits. So our first quarter is our first big audit season. So we did 30 individual audits for operators over the last few months, going through all of that documentation, showing here's where the staff came from that we're claiming, here's proof that it was eligible for the different compliance schemes, here's the voluntary report and all the backup documentation. So we're used to being audited, across the pretty significantly. And so it's building that trust to show here's all the paper trail that supports the SAF that you purchased. But especially now that some of the fuel is mandated, if you want to do something voluntary, that has to be over and above what we see on the mandates within Europe or within the UK. And so, as I mentioned, one of the big things we look at is how do we align those programs, and how do you, okay, knowing that there's going to be mandated fuel available in Le Bourget, how do you, on a voluntary basis, maybe uplift more, or different airports that you might visit have that option. But then tracking down all of that documentation, knowing which part was mandated versus voluntary, and kind of synthesizing all that into a report. That's where I think that value that we can bring it is on marrying what you see on the voluntary and the regulatory side, but doing it in a traceable way still.
Makes sense. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you and I are both working transatlantic and beyond. I mean, Rise is a European company that's now active in North America. For Air started in North America, is operating worldwide. And is it? I mean, clearly Europe has come up with an ETS scheme before anybody else, I think. Is it as simple as saying, operators in the EU are looking for compliance, and those in the US are doing voluntary, or is it slightly more nuanced than that?
At a certain level, yes. But the way a lot of the regulations work, it's all about where you fly, not where you're based. So even as US operators, if you fly to Europe, you're subject to those requirements. And that's true elsewhere too. So, Turkey has been looking at an ETS, China. We have about 8 other countries, Thailand, Singapore, Korea, Japan, all looking at SAF incentives or mandates as well. So if you visit those countries, you would have to be compliant with the SAF mandates that they're putting in place around the world. So when we launched 6 years ago, there was pretty much two regulations you had to worry about: CORSIA and EU ETS. We support customers now in about 25 different reporting schemes, and there's more than 100 out there that we're tracking that are some might be incentives, some might just be mandates, some might be reporting and disclosure requirements. So many different flavors of requirements out there, but the policy environment has gotten very complex over the last few years and continues to kind of change, with everybody doing their own thing. Even in the US now, so many states are doing their own incentives that about 20 states have different SAF incentive plans. So just even in the US, the compliance, burden has gotten more challenging. So you see in the US, it might be supporting compliance with that. We in the US, we actually do have like a small mandate for renewable fuels. In the US, we have a blending mandate for ethanol, but SAF can participate and get tax credits from kind of that same renewable fuels obligation. And that actually just hit the goal for 26 and 27 has been set at record highs compared to what it's ever been. This is the largest blending mandate that they've had. So that was, it just came out on Friday and was a really good boon for kind of SAF production in the US. So it's really kind of looking at what are the incentives if you're going to uplift SAF, which of these states, and especially as it's changing month to month, might make most sense to take the uplifts in and try to build that supply chain out. A lot of it's the work back with the FBOs to say, all right, I know you're bringing me SAF in Florida, but I need you to start looking at Illinois now because there's a tax credit, and we have to kind of work together on that. In Europe, the same thing of coordinating, where should we be uplifting? In Europe, you get a certain amount of free allowances to help support the cost of SAF, and you get more free allowances at certain airports versus other ones. So identifying what those airports are, what's the availability of SAF, getting that kind of set down in advance, and you might have 3 or 4 different incentive schemes that apply to a single airport. And so it's kind of about stacking ones that make sense and then helping people source that. And so you see these mandate and compliance requirements kind of for anybody who's traveling internationally. Especially, if you talk transatlantic, one of the big things we look at is around contrails, and the North Atlantic is where we see some of the biggest warming impacts from contrails. So that takes some transatlantic, coordination to look at how do we address that. But it's global, mandate and SAF optimization.
Yeah, so I mean, from listening to you, it appears it's no longer, Europe puts out the rules, and then North America works with voluntary. It's getting harmonized,
Hmm.
and by the sounds of it, incredibly complex too, right?
Very.
But and and I was wondering, I mean, you guys obviously have some products, which are the ratings, the availability to buy SAF, etc. But wouldn't you say that 4Air's mission is also, or maybe primarily, to educate the market? I mean, this, I think, even within business aviation operators, and we work with them all the time, I think the kind of knowledge of what schemes are available, how do I even start to comply with each of them? Where can I claim credits? Has become so complex. I mean, do you see yourself as almost on a mission to educate everybody?
I see us as kind of this intersection of operations, policy, and kind of the science out there. And we love to sit at that intersection of basically what's a lot of the science we still are understanding the impact of SAF or on the evolution of contrails. We're seeing policy design that incorporates both of those. We're seeing operators understand what's feasible to actually implement or achieve. And so this almost building a feedback loop, I think, between the three is where we've somewhat established ourselves intentionally or unintentionally. We've been able to build relationships into each of those groups. And so, for example, working on contrail avoidance, we've seen that in some of the research. The best mitigation you can do is to adjust your altitude, fly above or below those contrail regions. Well, there's a lot of reasons from an operational perspective that you can't fly above those contrail regions. Maybe it's a long haul flight and the aircraft is too heavy to get up to that region. Maybe it's an air traffic control restriction that deems you have to stay lower. Maybe the flight's too short and the aircraft doesn't have the capability to get up and down, and that's too much of a workload for ATC. So understanding what's the operational restrictions of why we didn't do contrail avoidance or we can't implement something that the science tells us we should, that gives us something we can go back to the policy side and say, okay, on these air traffic control routes, you're causing me to have a higher contrail impact because of the altitudes that you're holding us at. So how do we design the policy to be more understanding of operational limitations? Refuel EU is a great example. They set the uplift requirement at 90% of the fuel that you think you need. 90% is just really not feasible for most people. Even for the airlines that have the scheduled routes and know well in advance, they're not really able to meet that uplift requirement. The exemption requests have to be made 3 months in advance. Well, for non-scheduled operators, we don't know our schedule 3 months in advance, and we don't know where the aircraft might be flying. So there's this view of, okay, how do we make the policy smarter if we're trying to achieve, based on what's operationally realistic and what the science is telling us would be best practices. That's another one on the contrail side is how do we actually equate contrails into CO2 equivalents? Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. You're trying to compare something that has an impact over 18 hours to something that has an impact over 100 years. So those equivalence metrics are really challenging and something where the science and the policy needs to talk together. But both of those have an impact on the operations. So we need to understand kind of what that would look like and what decisions that might then influence based off the choices that we see. So that's where I think we've had a unique piece, and the education is always an important element that I think we love to see the progress of. Now we don't really have to tell people what SAF is. You still get occasionally the people who ask, is it safe to use? And you have to explain, what that is. But we've moved beyond, I think, a lot of that base education as an industry, and it's great to see the progress there. But best practices will continue to evolve. SAF and our understanding of where it can come from will continue to evolve. So much education ahead for us as well.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, it's not stopping, and I guess for the better, right? It's hopefully we'll get some more harmonization of these rules. The rules hopefully will be more applicable as well. As a company based in Europe, we were certainly very aware of all of the inconsistencies with Refuel EU. And my take from working with operators is that they're quite happy to comply, and they're quite happy to, modify and alter how they operate, provided that it makes sense, and it's actually going to be feasible, and it's actually going to have an impact. If you think you're just ticking boxes, on a form that was designed somewhere, among people who probably don't fly as much, then yeah, that's more tricky. So
Yeah.
certainly that push for consistency and for making it making it understandable, making it truly impactful is big. Yeah. So more work for air in the next few years.
Yeah, it's a great way you frame it. People are very happy to comply if, as long as it makes sense, and as long as they don't feel like it's just a hidden tax. If it's meant to really help accomplish or support aviation, I think what we see in the funds that are collected from EU ETS, a lot of that's reinvested into supporting grants for new technologies, new SAF production methods, and so you can see the impact of what those funds are used for. That's something I think where people look at and can understand the purpose, and so that's where the policy design is really important. People can see why we're doing it, and what it supports is really important. People
Yeah,
can
yeah.
see
And,
why we're
and by the
doing
way,
it,
Kennedy,
and what it
on that
supports.
front, ESG as a whole, I guess, may still feel that for a lot of operators like a burden, right? Oh, got to do it, or when I have time. How do you make it appealing for operators, or indeed, the clients on board the plane, or the owners? How do you make it appealing for them to actually, genuinely start considering a transition towards something that's more sustainable? Do you have tips and tricks that you can share, or is it, to kind of help try and buy the vision to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the we focus a lot on
Yeah.
mostly kind of the E of the ESG, right? It's been very much kind of the environmental focus, but one of the biggest challenges we have with that is it's so intangible, right? You can't see the CO2 in the atmosphere. You can't see the emission reductions from SAF. You can't see the even the impact of carbon offsets directly. So getting people to see it or feel what the impact of it is one of the biggest challenges we have. Um, so I think that's one of the things we still are thinking about how we can solve. How can you bring things more tangibly back, and how do you report maybe on progress? We try to tie in as much of that documentation to show into a summary kind of certificate, where your impact was around the world. Um, and so we're trying to improve a lot of the reporting, I think, to make it a little bit easier to see. But not being able to step outside and seeing it with your own eyes, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have ahead for it. That's where I think you will see contrails as a growing piece, because you can see whether there's a contrail being made or not. And so, from a public perception of what aviation's industry, the aviation's impact is, as well as your ability to see did I make a contrail or not, and see that more real time, I think is something that you'll see more and more attention on, because it's a visible impact of aviation. Um, but otherwise, it's been, I think our focus is to make it accessible for people. I think we try to show a little bit more of the story of, as we travel to places for fun or for work. Aviation really is serves as a tool to create stewards. And aviation is a connection. We're inspired to travel. So many There's kind of an innate curiosity thing in people. We all want to travel, even during COVID. That our ability to not travel is what made so much of us want to travel once it came past COVID. And so, how do we still support, our drive to travel to see the world, but do it in a more sustainable way? How do we make sure that we can keep doing the travel and do it, grow the aviation industry without growing our emissions? That's where we've tried to tell the story a little bit of we want to continue traveling. We're inspired to travel. We just want aviation to help us get us there in a more sustainable way. Hmm.
Yeah, very interesting. The just the ability to see it and touch it is is what gets people interested. So yeah, to your point, again, it's education, right? So how do you get people to truly understand what they're able to do? Yeah. So lots going on, certainly. So my last question for you, Kennedy, is, in this changing world, we're going towards more and more regulation. You pointed that out, but is there anything else you see changing in the business aviation industry, or more specifically for air? What's on the agenda?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the realities we've accepted is that the policy is not going to get simpler, and it's going to continue to change and evolve and devolve where you see different countries, different blocks go different directions in how they approach policy. So being our biggest focus is being prepared for that, being a little bit more adaptable in how we can bring on, be ready for new regulation, help operators more easily be prepared for it. So a lot of our work has been kind of automation, bringing in some of the control aspects into all the different policy aspects, into all of the SAF tracking requirements. And for the longest time, I think the industry's lived in Excel to do that. So things like the SAF registry were our first push to really modernize and automate some of this workload. So for us, it's really about doubling down on some of the technology. Another good example is we're actually announcing a new kind of out of our aviation climate fund, out of the research partnerships, a new partnership around contrail mitigation. So there's a very cool effort out there to look at taking satellite imagery and ground-based cameras and using AI to automatically identify contrails and then match it to the aircraft. And so there's actually networks of cameras out there already, kind of from weather stations and meteor space observatories that you can use to see the contrails. And so that'll help us better understand some of the science behind it, as well as maybe even provide real-time tracking to contrail hotspots and be able to use that in mitigation efforts. So looking at opportunities like that and how do we take technology that's out there and apply it towards some of these, remaining challenges that we see in the industry.
Yeah, I don't know if technology will save us, but technology certainly is is the answer to a lot of these challenges. We're a tech company, you're a tech company in a sense, and so yeah, it's very interesting. A lot of that's moving so fast.
Yeah.
The contrail identification. I mean, contrails essentially are cirrus clouds, right? So you're going to have to distinguish in some areas a cirrus cloud generated by an airplane versus pre-existing cirrus clouds. So not a small feat, I guess. For
And that's exactly the biggest challenge is teaching it. So we'll you teach it by having humans look at it and say, okay, this is a
yeah,
contrail, this isn't is not a contrail, and just as you build more and more training sets. So yeah, at night sometimes I find myself just painting little circles around a contrail. This is
yeah,
one, this isn't one, because you do have that artificial cirrus cloudiness versus natural induced cirrus cloudiness that you have
yeah,
to
yeah,
differentiate.
yeah. Fascinating topic, and I know you could go on about contrails for a few hours. Unfortunately, our time's up. Thank you so much, Kennedy, for coming online. Very insightful as always, and looking forward to more interactions in the next few months. And all the best to yourself and for Air.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to talk with you.